Tonight, we won't open dusty chronicles to tally kings or weigh their crowns. Instead, we'll slip into a hall where the air tastes faintly of honey and ash, and the rafters remember more secrets than any throne room ever could. Here, in the hush of Asgard's benches, power is not shouted in decrees, it is whispered in glances, folded into riddles, and carried on the perfume of someone who left too late. The gods walk like drafts through these chambers, sometimes cold, sometimes scented, always unsettling. A single laugh might outlive a war, a single promise might tilt the fate of worlds, and a single sip of mead, stolen or shared, could spill into poetry that survives longer than stone. So lower the lights. Let the weight of those twilight halls lean gently on your shoulders. And if your breath begins to fall in rhythm with the slow hush of myth, don't resist. That's just the sagas unrolling around you. If quiet journeys through forgotten myths keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next story told by firelight in the north will be waiting for you there. Odin's quiet affairs have the patience of ravens circling, but Loki's entanglements flutter like moths who insist they are birds. He is a collector of entrances. He compliments a hairstyle by borrowing it, and the mirror blinks twice, unsure whom to admire. The Tailies speak of him slipping into shapes the way others slip into conversation, a salmon that knows every ripple by name, a fly with excellent timing, a mare whose eyelashes have an unhelpful glamour. There is a builder who asks for a particular payment if he can finish a wall, and Loki says, of course, what could go wrong? We'll keep an eye on the calendar. The eye blinks, the calendar blushes. Soon a foal with 8 legs is trotting around Asgard like a solution that arrived before anyone finished the problem. Loki smiles the way lantern light smiles when it finds a shiny spoon. He flatters giants and gods alike, and too often the flattery grows feet. Someone receives a gift that is also a riddle. Someone else receives a riddle that is also a promise. Both are wrapped in the same silk thread, which frays on purpose. Loki is the friend who rearranges the furniture of an evening, not maliciously, just to see if the room has more options. And somehow the new layout includes a bouquet where there was once an oath. Between worlds, the breeze is warmer than anyone expects. Mortals look up from their kettles and find that a traveler understands the weather better than the local clouds. A king dreams of a stranger in a blue cloak whose advice tastes like iron and honey, and 9 months afterward a prince is born with a thoughtful gaze and a suspicious talent for climbing. A poet stumbles over a rhyme until a one-eyed guest gestures toward the sky and says, "Try the star behind that star." The poem rises like bread. These quiet crossings leave a trail of small artifacts, a brooch shaped like a ship, a belt knot nobody else can untie, a lullaby that works on colicky infants and anxious horses. The gods do not collect mortals in a dramatic way. They collect them like teacups from distant markets, amused by the slight wobble in the glaze. And the mortals, for their part, keep these visits the way one keeps a secret ingredient. Later scholars will argue about which rulers were sired by which god. The bards will simply say that certain families snore in runic meter, and that is evidence enough. The neighbors across the borders are tall, literal, and surprisingly poetic in private. Giants greet desire the way mountains greet weather, not trying to stop it, just taking very good notes. Freyr watches Gur across 9 bright meadows and decides that horizons are merely shy doorways. He sends Skirnir with gifts and a speech that includes the full table of contents. There's a pause long enough to make even sunlight blink, and then a meeting is scheduled. Freyr, being practical, places his excellent sword on the top shelf so he can carry flowers with both hands. The sword is safe there, he tells himself, like a set of house keys tucked into a rarely used fruit bowl. Elsewhere an elf tends a garden so precise that dew writes its name on every leaf, and a god wandering through cannot help admiring the handwriting. Bonds form the way moss forms on stones, patient, pale, and confident of their eventual greenness. The air between realms smells of pine and cooled iron. It is the fragrance of agreements that do not entirely belong to language. All of this, naturally, rearranges the chairs in Asgard. Jealousy here is domestic rather than dramatic. It looks like someone moving a cup 3 inches to the left. Frigg's gaze is as calm as linen laid flat on a table, covering the fidgeting of the table legs. Freya opens a jewelry casket and closes it again, as if her necklace Brisingamen hums a note only she can hear. She is not angry so much as cataloging. Sif adjusts her hair, which once was wheat and became gold, and pretends not to see the way compliments light and then extinguish around her like summer moths. Even Thor, who prefers straightforward weather, squints at all this like a man reading a recipe with too many adjectives. The feeling is less a storm than a draft in a longhouse. Noticeable, but not worth getting up to fix. Everyone continues to eat, and someone tells a joke with a very slow punchline, which arrives tomorrow, curls up on the hearthrug, and falls asleep. And if you lean a little closer, you may notice that not all sagas begin with thunder or battle cries. Some arrive quietly through the creak of a bench, the trace of perfume in a hall, or the way a single laugh lingers longer than it should. It is in that softer twilight that the gods of the north reveal themselves, not only in crowns or storms, but in whispers, sighs, and the weight of memory etched into wood and mead. The wood holds the shape of an elbow, the scent of a whisper, the laugh that pretended to be a cough. Odin, the High One with one eye and at least 3 pockets for secrets, moved through those halls like a quiet draft. And sometimes the draft smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. The stories about him never hurry. They arrive like snowflakes landing on a sleeve, each one slightly different, none of them in a rush to melt. A traveler passes by a farmstead in Midgard and ties a charm over a cradle, and the baby sleeps so well that the family names a whole year after that nap. A winter-bright princess named Reinder listens for 3 nights before answering, and the reply becomes a child whose name will one day feel like iron in the hand. Gunlet keeps watch in a mountain of stone and song, and a stranger who knows how to speak to Lox politely, with compliments, bars 3 sips that become an entire river of poetry. These are romances that wear academic glasses. He says he is here for research, and somehow the candles burn lower and the moon raises an eyebrow. If you're still awake later, you can subscribe to hear more of these meticulously footnoted feelings or not. I am not keeping a ledger under the world tree tonight. This is only a soft inventory of sighs. Promises, however, prefer tidy shelves and do not appreciate being repurposed into decorations. One oath was given in a courtyard paved with frost in exchange for a wall to keep trouble out. The payment requested was delicate and inconvenient, which in bureaucracy often means inevitable. Another promise was made beside a field, between a god who could not stop looking at a giant woman and a servant who said, "I know a way, but it involves a list." Some vows were whispered by candlelight and promptly forgot which drawer they were in. Others were public and carved into wood, which, being wood, remembered everything, including splinters. Freyr's sword stayed on its high shelf, pawed occasionally by dust motes doing their best impression of responsible guardians. The builder's horse trotted in circles that spelled maybe in cursive. Loki's helpful solutions kept creating new categories in the Asgardian ledger: miscellany of affections, outcomes pending, return date uncertain. Eventually, the shelves begin to lean under the weight, and the future notices. Ragnarok is usually described as a loud event, but tonight it is more like a librarian clearing her throat. You can almost hear the cards sliding into their proper boxes. Freyr looks for the sword and finds the bouquet, quite dried now, still pleasant, not much use in a duel. Loki's many affections have grown into a family tree that resembles a weather map. The forecast is complicated. with a chance of wolves and various nautical challenges. The wall once promised is solid in some places and optimistic in others, and optimism, while adorable, is not the same as stone. The gods do not panic in this telling. They continue to eat their dinners. Someone asks for more butter. Thor misplaces his fork, which is not a metaphor. He simply misplaces it. The end of the world, like most ends, is simply the moment when you stop editing and put the pages in order. But consequence is not only a bell, it is an echo. After the sorting comes a very gentle humming. The romances that shaped the great unshaping do not vanish. They become footpaths in the dark, used mainly by memory. A child with a complicated parentage grows up with the oddly comforting sense of being both map and margin. A giantess lights the lamps at dusk and hums a tune she once heard from a god, pretending to be a simple traveler. The tune keeps moths from singeing their wings. A mortal king tells his heirs never to make a promise without a shelf within reach, and they laugh, storing the advice exactly where he told them to. Even the Mead of Poetry drips a little whenever a story like this is told too softly. A drop lands on someone's tongue and becomes a line break that arrives precisely on time. If you're still awake, and if your eyes are more than half closed, you might consider following this series. You can also let the suggestion float down like a feather and land where it pleases. The feather is not under oath. The knight likes to keep a list. It is not a judgmental list, more like the tally of cups washed and plates stacked at a quiet feast. On it are the secret romances beyond Frigg's well-ordered calendar, and Loki's side door affairs that braided trickery with tenderness in a way nobody could quite untie. On it are the visits between realms, mortals who arrange their hair the way they arrange their fields, straight and hopeful, and neighbors with tall doorways who accepted love like weather, steady and unembarrassed. On it are jealousies that never learned to shout, content to nudge teaspoons, and promises that became architecture or footnotes, depending on who remembered to look up. The list includes the way Ragnar gathered itself from those small items and walked in politely, hat in hand, a guest who genuinely believes the party is over and has come to help stack chairs. The list also keeps room for echoes, because echoes are very good at finding their way into margins and making a home there. If we remain here a little more, the details begin to braid themselves in slow motion. Gunlod's chamber is cool and smells like stone that has learned a few songs by heart. Odin, who has many names, uses a name with fewer edges when he visits, and the cups he borrows are warmed between his palms first, a courtesy to both drink and guardian. In Midgard, a woman sweeping her threshold in the early blue hour finds a coin stamped with a raven. She spends it on salt and never entirely stops writing. In Jotunheim, a giantess plants hazel and willow along a stream because someone once told her the best secrets happen near water, and she is curious, not for scandal, but to see whether the water nods. In Alfheim, the elves discuss the morality of favors using the language of pruning, which is more persuasive than it sounds. These are small vignettes, but they are where the world actually lives. Not in the clangor of outcomes, but in the cupboard where the everyday china learns everyone's stories. Asgard's halls, for their part, have grown used to being a museum of feelings that refuse to sit still. A chair remembers 3 different claims to the same story. A window has watched 100 sideways glances try not to exist and has decided to collect them anyway, like pressed petals under its frame. Freya carries Brisingamen with the air of someone who knows both how precious and how replaceable beauty is. She is tender with it the way a librarian is tender with a book that has seen many hands. Frigg is the winter hearth, patient, seeing, not fooled by smoke. Sif's hair shines, which is what gold does when it knows it is being looked at kindly. Thor, dependable as weather that finally chooses rain, fetches more wood. Everyone understands that the rumors will continue because rumors are how the world remembers to breathe. They are less about truth and about the soft friction of names brushing past each other in a corridor. When jealousy speaks up, it does so with a voice like late evening. It asks where you've been, but not unkindly. It mostly wants to know if you ate. It straightens the tablecloth and tucks in the corner that always escapes. It remembers that once, long ago, a builder set a stone slightly crooked, and no one corrected it, and now plants have found a home there. The crookedness becomes a garden. The garden becomes a place to meet. The meeting becomes a promise, and the promise someday becomes a story told in a calm voice like this one. With no sharp corners and no hurry, while someone dozes and someone else stares at the ceiling and traces a small design there with their eyes. The design looks suspiciously like runes spelling out, "Please rest." And if the last thing you hear is the soft truth that desire does not end so much as decide to be quiet for a while, that will be enough. Somewhere a high shelf keeps a sleeping sword company. Somewhere a bouquet, long dried, still remembers the hand that held it and does not regret being flowers instead of steel. Somewhere the Mead of Poetry condenses on the inside of a cup like a weather report you can taste. Somewhere an 8-legged horse stamps once in a dream, and the dream obliges by widening the road. The gods drift in and out of these scenes the way stars drift in and out of cloud edges, not gone, just unannounced. We are merely listening to how the night files them patiently by candle scent and door height, and the particular tone of footsteps on wooden floors. And now, as the rafters hum and the bench releases the memory of an elbow, the story does what it always does at this hour. It keeps walking more slowly, still naming doorways, smoothing pillows, placing one last cup, the exact width of a sigh from the edge of the table where it will wait for morning, or for you, whichever arrives first. You might not expect the god who can become a salmon, a bird, a fog, and occasionally a very persuasive idea to be a patient flirt. But Loki prefers to begin softly, the way dew begins at the edge of grass. He is the gentle click of a latch, the compliment that sounds casual until you realize it arrived with a blueprint rolled inside it. In the longhouses of Asgard, people tell stories about him the way they fold blankets, carefully with a little smoothing of corners, aware that if you shake them out too briskly, the dust of excitement flies up and keeps everyone awake. They say he never knocks straight on a door. He pauses at the wall first to see if the door would like to borrow a different hinge. They say he never asks a name. He offers one, trying it on the way one tries a hat in passing, and if the hat suits, the conversation strolls forward as if it had always owned a brim. Loki's seductions are not always romantics. Some are practical to the point of housekeeping, but he treats them with the same delicacy. He coaxes a promise out of a silence, a favor out of a glance, a secret out of a cup that thought it was only holding mead. If you're still awake a little later, you can subscribe for more strolls among these unhurried doorways. Or you can simply drift. Loki wouldn't mind. He very much approves of drifting, as long as the current is going somewhere faintly complicated. When a builder came to Asgard and offered a wall, the kind that keeps trouble from wandering in with its boots still muddy, Loki was there at the edge of the conversation, arranging the price tag so it faced the least obvious direction. The agreement was made, the calendar started counting, and the builder's horse, Zalfari, proved more inclined to work than any creature with hooves has a right to be. The gods had one of those meetings where everyone speaks in low voices and then checks the sky, as if perhaps the sky had turned into a helpful index. Loki examined the situation like a tailor examining a hem. A small alteration would do. The night that followed is less a scandal than a footnote, though footnotes can be very influential when read in a warm room with steady lamplight. Loki slipped the hinge of his own shape and became a Mare whose patience could soothe the itch out of a nap. He wandered where Svasau wandered, not hurried, not obvious, more like a melody with a well-timed rest. In the morning, there were hoof prints and patterns that resembled compliments written in cursive, and the builder's progress slowed in a way that looked almost philosophical. What happened next is usually explained with a cough and the phrase, and then later, because the important part, for our quiet purposes, is that from such soft mischief a fool arrived Sleipnir by name Eight-Leg, and unembarrassed by the mathematics of that. No thunderclap, no scandalous curtain, only a remarkable horse born from an evening when a problem was wooed instead of solved. In Asgard, Sleipnir's hooves sounded like a thoughtful drumbeat, and no one accused anyone of anything in a tone louder than silk. Loki was not greedy with affection. He was simply curious about what it could unlock. In Jotunheim's Ironwood, where the trees carry their shadows like shawls, a giantess named Angerboa kept a hearth in a house with many patient corners. Loki visited her the way frost visits window panes, lightly, leaving small maps that look like letters if you squint. They spoke in a language that did not require oaths, mostly about weather and how the moon knows everyone's business and tells no one. The children who came of that companionship were unusual in a way that made the world check its definitions. A wolf cub whose paws were a size too large for his age, a girl whose gaze belonged in libraries that had not been built, and a sea creature who preferred to be measured in horizons rather than lengths. In livelier versions of the tale, these children are announced with trumpets or warnings. Ours prefers quiet nursery notes and the sound of a kettle deciding to sing. Loki did not cradle them, because the world had its own ways of cradling what it did not yet understand. He did, however, visit often enough to learn the particular creak of Angerboa's door, and how to nudge it so that it creaked less, a skill that, like many of his best skills, was half politeness and half preparation. Yet Loki's steadiness can be startling. Seijen, whose name means victory, but whose presence felt more like a gentle hand placed on a table to stop it wobbling, married him with the calm of a person who knows exactly how long bread takes to rise in her hearth. She did not try to edit his weather. She kept a small cup for catching the drips of whatever the day spilled, and people whispered that she had invented patience using only twine and a clean cloth. Loki, in return, remembered her preferences in the way a river remembers its banks, not rigidly, but with constant, affectionate consultation. He made sure that whenever he left a room with her, the lamp was turned down, not merely out, because he had noticed she disliked waking to complete dark. In a world where gods pursued meteors for sport, this was the romance that wore house shoes. It is considered impolite to comment on how many shapes a person keeps ready, but Seijen counted them the way one counts spoons after washing absently, to make sure no one is missing content with a household where the doors fit their frames and the laughter arrived unannounced but never unwelcome. Back in the bright halls, Loki's compliments kept inventing chores. When Sif's hair wheat gold and the pride of an entire harvest found itself unexpectedly shorter, thanks to a moment of Loki's playful curiosity meeting a pair of quick hands, there was a pause so wide you could shelve winter in it. Loki did what he often did when a prank finished speaking and a solution needed to begin. He went to the neighbors who master small miracles. In Nidavellir, the dwarves keep workshops hot enough to make ideas melt and reform into better ones. Loki walked in as if he were borrowing a cup of sugar, a sentence he always delivered with excellent sincerity. He convinced them to spin new hair of gold, so refined it learned to grow and to envy wind. While he was there, this is his style, he suggested several additional gifts, just in case the day wanted variety. A spear that never misses its point, a ring that performs multiplication, without complaint, a boar with the pride of a sunrise. The dwarves obliged, and when he returned to Asgard, Sif's hair lay down against her head like a field reassured by gentle rain. If this story has a romance, it is between Loki and possibilities. He courts them with punctuality and brings them home like bouquets that happen to reshape national inventories. Sometimes his seductions were even smaller, and therefore more effective. He charmed a net out of nothing but the notion of knotted string, because a good net is essentially a necklace that has chosen to be useful. He flattered a door into thinking it was a window, and the door slid aside with the modesty of a curtain. He apologized to a goose for borrowing its wattle, and the goose forgave him because the apology included accurate goose compliments, which are rare. When he turned into a fly to interrupt a craftsman's precise work, just a soft reminder that perfection is often improved by negotiation, he picked exactly the place to land that would itch the most but offend the least. This is not cruelty. It is the art of making the future say fine in a tone that means thank you. Loki kept a mental pantry of such gentle techniques, labeled in neat script: nudge, delay, distract, amuse, reframe, delight. He believed that affection and problem-solving are cousins who enjoy the same pastries. Desire between gods and mortals is often told as lightning. Loki preferred it as lantern light. He would wander Midgard in a traveler's cloak, the fabric not new, but very good at pretending to be new, and find the kind of household where the door latch had been repaired more than once with love and a little stubbornness. He accepted a seat by the fire as though the seat had invited him, praised the soup using adjectives it hadn't heard since its grandmother was a broth, and admired the way the family kept their spoons stacked by size like a choir. Often that was enough. People gave secrets to those who admired their spoons. On rare nights, a widow with a smile, like sunrise through fog, would pour him an extra ladleful and tell him how the world forgets to write the names of those who mend, and he would listen with the seriousness of a ledger. He was not collecting hearts as trophies. He collected moments where a person felt seen, because those moments are better currency than silver when you need the future to cooperate. If a child who overheard these conversations grew up to be gifted with words, that was not a conquest. It was an investment in music. His meetings with the other folk, the elves with their tidy gardens, the giants with their patient kitchens, had the etiquette of tea visits. In Alfheim, Loki once spent an afternoon praising a hedge for its philosophical boundaries, and the hedge became the kind of metaphor that writers take home wrapped in parchment. An elf offered him a pear that tasted faintly of carefully stored sunlight. He did not flirt with the elf so much as with the idea of organization. By the end of the day, his pockets contained 3 labels for shelves he did not own yet. In Jotunheim, the tables were larger and the humor slower, which Loki found restful. A giantess with hands like thoughtful bread asked him why gods bother counting, and he said it helps us remember we were once smaller. The answer pleased her enough to send him away with a jar of cloudberries and a promise that could be interpreted at least 4 ways, which is Loki's preferred number of interpretations. These were not affairs with a capital A. They were gentle treaties cooked over low heat. Jealousy in Asgard never had reason to be loud over these things. Frigg kept the palace calendar and the palace silence with equal skill. She saw much and said little, arranging her knowledge the way one arranges folded clothing in a chest by season, with cedar tucked between the stacks. She did not dislike Loki. She disliked drafts, and he brought them. Freyja, whose jewelry clinks like a bell that is also a vow, watched him the way a cat watches sunlight move, amused and slightly territorial. Thor muttered, because muttering is very good for maintaining the weather of one's mind. Odin observed with that one eye that had seen enough bargains to stock a market. Each of them recognized that Loki's soft entanglements often led to useful objects, better stories, or both. It is difficult to scold someone who keeps improving the cutlery. So the household allowed him his drifting, the way a well-run inn allows a cat to sleep on a chair where no one intended to sit. Broken promises, however, collect like dull knives, unobtrusive, a little dangerous when you reach into the drawer. Loki understood this. He knew that his charming interventions left threads dangling, and he kept a pocket for spare threads. When someone said, "You'll fix this, won't you?" he heard the invitation for what it was, a romance with responsibility. He returned to old agreements like a gardener returns to perennials, checking that the roots are where he left them. Even his most famous deviations came with gifts. The mischief with Sif's hair gave Asgard its greatest treasures. The Murray's midnight stroll delivered a steed whose hooves could outpace worry. He was not tidy, but he was generous with the aftermath. All of these entanglements, these borrowed shapes and lent futures, became part of the slow wind that moves the sagas toward their inevitable sortings. Yet the connection is not dramatic. It is a soft geometry. If A once smiled at B while pretending to be C, then D will someday find a sword missing from a shelf and understand, vaguely, why bouquets matter. If a giantess once served a god cloudberry jam with a spoon carved from driftwood, a poet will much later write a line that tastes of salt and sweetness at the same time and will not know why. Loki's seductive tricks are not arrows, they are ripples. By the time they reach shore, they are only a rhythm the sand finds familiar, a lull that makes ships think of home. Should you wish to keep listening for that rhythm, I'll be here still speaking softly shelving words, beside one another as if they were cups that will be needed in the morning, and Loki will be somewhere between a door and a window making. Either one feel admired enough to open a little wider, just enough for sleep to walk in without knocking. Jealousy in Asgard does not stamp its foot. It simply rearranges chairs a little, the way a breeze will nudge a curtain and then pretend it didn't. If you listened from the long end of the hall, you would hear nothing but the respectable sounds of a successful evening, the soft clink of cups, the slow arithmetic of a harp, the ordinary conversation of gods who have known one another for longer than dust has known shelves. Yet jealousy walks there like a mild draught. It is the difference between two benches pushed a finger's width apart. It is the way someone sets down a cup and then turns the handle very carefully toward nobody. People say the great betrayals began as whispered storms, but that is too dramatic for the hour. They began as small domestic weather. Someone praised a necklace without remembering who had to barter for it. Someone admired new hair and forgot, just for a moment, the quiet dignity of older braids. Someone said a certain spear never misses, and another person wondered, with the gentlest curiosity, whether spears that never miss also overhear compliments meant for other weapons. If you're still awake in a minute or two, and you find this sort of furniture shifting oddly soothing, feel free to subscribe for more stories where nothing happens urgently, or let your eyelids practice being doors. I won't take attendance. The object most likely to provoke a draft was a necklace you already know by rumor, even if you've never seen it. Brisingamen, which sits around Freya's throat as if it were a private sunrise on a very good day. When she enters a room, the hall lights itself politely so as not to be rude to the jewels. People pretend not to look, and then look anyway in the reflective surfaces of spoons. The story of how it was acquired is a rumor needed by many hands, and everyone claims they were not in the kitchen when it was made. Freya is both generous and precise. She shares attention freely and then keeps a little ledger in her head where she enters, in very small letters, who forgot to say thank you. The dwarves who forged the necklace enjoyed being precise as well. They like payment measured in evenings and bargains measured in technicalities. It is how their furnaces pass the time. The result is that Brisingamen glows, and glow is a verb that creates minor climate. Frigg is too wise to be shaken by it. Her jealousy, when it happens, resembles a folded shawl no one remembers leaving on that chair, but others find their thoughts turning into tidy comparisons. Why does her collar sing when mine only whispers? Why does sunlight prefer certain throats? Why does praise walk to the same table twice? None of this is war. It is household arithmetic. And Freya, who is not cruel, sometimes fingers the clasp as if reminding the hall that beauty is a guest with good manners, not an argument. Even hair was a weather report. Sif's gold grew again, as everyone knows, and lay down in obedient waves that looked like harvest behaving. People were relieved, and then people noticed. It is not that anyone begrudged her a field of hair that obeyed both wind and calendar. It is that admiration multiplies like rabbits when left alone. Thor watched with a husband's steady pride, which is one of the least jealous things a person can do, but pride itself leaves tracks, and tracks invite commentary. It catches the firelight, someone said, as if the firelight had been hiding from them all their life. It catches the moonlight, said another, although the moon was not even indoors. Loki smiled as a person smiles when a small accident has matured into a better object. And somewhere in the middle benches, a goddess who was famous for other qualities, perhaps a perfect sense of north, perhaps the ability to pour exactly enough mead for any number of guests without counting, wondered whether she would have to learn a new skill to keep her place in the songs, something flashy like taming auroras with a spoon. Jealousy in Asgard, you see, is practical. It leads to project planning. It appears as a new weaving design, as a vow to sing louder, and then remembering that louder is not the point, as a decision to adopt a raven and teach it compliments. Odin himself is not immune. He keeps 2 ravens as co-workers, and sometimes when they return from Midgard and report that a poet told a mortal woman she has eyes like the Mead of Poetry, Odin coughs into his beard in a way that says, yes, well, the Mead of Poetry is a commitment, not a simile. His beard, being loyal, agrees. There were rituals designed to keep drafts from turning into drafts of policy. Oaths were the insulation of that house. If jealousy whispered, an oath would clear its throat. In the temples, the oath ring lay on the altar like a sleeping circle. Hands warmed it, breath fogged it, and words braided themselves around it with the seriousness of bread dough when it decides it is time to rise. People swore by the ring, and the gods listened with paperwork in mind. Forseti, who prefers tidy shelves and chairs that do not wobble, found such proceedings restful. Bragi, whose skill with words is a little like an embroidery that fixes tears as it decorates, held the cup when necessary and nodded in a cadence that meant, this too will be a stanza. On feast nights, jealousy's draft would curl around the pillars and then die beneath the weight of proper promises. Someone would vow to return a borrowed shield and actually do it. Someone would swear to praise another's craft 3 times before breakfast and then discover that praise, when done correctly, tastes like good porridge. The hall learned, again and again, that vows are blankets that cover a multitude of small chills. Still, there were blinks in the insulation, and in those blinks certain promises exhaled at the wrong time. One such breath was let out beside a wolf cub who was still trying to figure out where his paws ended and the world began. Fenrir learned trust the way many of us do by lending it and checking whether it comes back in the same shape. The gods, veterans of many creative solutions, asked if he would wear a harmless ribbon, a little bet to prove his strength. He agreed, because it is polite to accept a ribbon when your elders present one with smiles. When the ribbon turned out to be cleverer than it looked, the cub opened his mouth to receive reassurance in the form of a hand, and Tyr, who keeps a brave honesty as a kind of personal crest, gave his own. There is an interpretation of this moment that includes drums and capitals. It isn't helpful tonight. Instead, imagine a room where the air realizes it has become thinner by a hair's breadth. The ribbon holds. The hand is gone, but the promise is gone first, and that is the temperature change the hall will remember. Fenrir does not howl. He files the fact the way a librarian files an overdue slip without fuss in the correct drawer. Tyr does not complain. He knows that a broken promise is a heavier thing to carry than an absent hand. The rest of the company is quiet for a long time. Even the lamps seem to trim themselves. Another promise that lost its way was made to a builder whose horse did not know how to be tired. The agreement on the table looked, at first glance, like sensible architecture. Deliver the wall by a date and receive wages measured in names that sound extravagant only if you then ever price materials. It is a matter of record that the builder's progress was slowed by an evening's worth of logistics performed at a canter, and that, By morning, the calendar smiled in a different language. We are not prosecuting that night. We are only noting that when the gods looked at the ledger a second time, they preferred a different arithmetic. A promise politely changed into a suggestion. The result was a wall that still keeps drafts down, and an 8-legged horse who writes footnotes in the air when he runs, which counts as a happy outcome if you are a wall or a horse. Yet even happy outcomes can leave a faint ring on the tablecloth of memory, as if a cup had been set down and lifted again while no one was watching. People do not speak of it at breakfast. They add honey to their bowls and talk about weather, but the tablecloth keeps its little circles. Not all broken promises belong to the gods. Mortals were very skilled at something we might call creative postponement. At the things, those broad-shouldered meetings where business pretends to be a picnic, men swear beautifully and then discovered that time is a dog that sometimes wanders away from the cart. The oath ring did its best, but it cannot follow you home. Skalds, who are experts in excuses that rhyme, invented verses for the occasions, and Forseti insisted on hearing them all, because even a postponed truth is still data. Oathbreakers have a particular afterlife in the stories, the kind that involves drafts from below, yet the sagas tell it calmly. Like a housekeeping note, if you leave promises at the edge of your plate, something else will finish them for you. Jealousy and promises are related. Both prefer to be tidied away when company arrives, and company in Asgard is almost always arriving. The gentlest betrayals are not grand lies, but little edits. Someone says, "I will be there at dawn," and arrives at a version of dawn that is generous to the sleeper. Someone says, "I will keep this secret," and they do, but they tell a metaphor that closely resembles it, and hope the secret won't recognize itself. Someone says, "I will love you exactly as you are," and afterward realizes that what they meant was, "I will love you exactly as you are as long as you keep your calendar neatly." The hall does not punish these. It merely incorporates them into its grain. Oak remembers every cup ever set upon it, even when polished. In this way, the house of the gods becomes a record of vows that warmed it and drafts that tested the corners. It is pleasant to imagine that jealousy and broken promises make a direct path toward the large events. The way a footpath eventually becomes a road by sheer good manners. In truth, they spiral like steam rising from a cup. Some of that steam becomes weather later. Some of it disappears into the ceiling and is forgotten except by wooden beams that like diaries. Yet even spirals have a direction if you squint kindly. The wolf who learned a lesson about ribbons will someday be very good at teaching lessons of his own. The builder's horse that ran between ledger lines will carry a particular rider on errands that involve the horizon, which is a sort of promise the sky makes to the earth. The necklace that glowed and made the hall drafty with comparison will gleam on nights, when a council needs to remember that beauty is not a budget item but a pressure system. The hair that grew again will shine at the exact moment. A storm needs a reason to choose one direction instead of another. The oath ring will sit on altars and feel every finger as a weather vane feels wind, turning, learning the taste of each season's breath. If you look very closely, you can see how these soft treasons, jealousies folded into napkins, promises thinned by politeness, teach everyone to carry a cup more steadily. Frigg watches and adjusts the household locks by fraction. Freya watches and adds an extra clasp to something no one notices until it matters. Tyr watches and learns to pick up things with the other hand, which is more impressive than it sounds. Loki watches and designs a new ribbon, supposedly harmless, out of the sound a cat's paw makes on a ladder. Thor watches and practices counting to 10 before speaking, which improves the general weather by a measurable degree. Odin watches, of course, and sends the ravens out with the specific instruction to bring back stories that will reassure the house that it is fundamentally sound. They do, though sometimes the ravens trade stories with one another in midair just to keep the paperwork lively. It is not a betrayal, merely an administrative romance. By now, the lamps have dimmed to their evening selves, and even Brisingamen has agreed to rest. Jealousy is asleep in a chair it only meant to sit in for a moment. Promises drowse like cats on windowsills, their tails flicking when the wind mentions an idea. The oath ring is cool again. The ribbon remembers how to be just ribbon. If you lie very still, you can hear the hall breathing. A longhouse sigh that says nothing dangerous is happening. Only furniture learning how to be polite to the people who will sit on it tomorrow. We could follow the steam of these small choices up until later years where the air is different and louder, but that would be unfair to sleep. Instead, we will leave the beam to keep its diary and let the drafts remember they are only air with opinions. If you are still awake, you might find one of those opinions curling around your pillow, reminding you that the most important promises tonight are the light ones: to breathe, to rest, to listen as the house teaches itself the old lesson again. Quiet is the kindest weather, and to let the story drift where it was going anyway, which is nowhere urgent a place even. Jealousy can love because every chair there already faces the fire. You might not think a love story can loosen a hinge on the world, but the quiet ones are good at that. From far away, Ragnarok sounds like thunder rolling along the rim of the sky, all drums and red banners. Up close, it looks more like personal housekeeping. It looks like someone giving away a tool because they trust they won't need it, and then realizing later they do. It looks like a promise made at twilight because twilight is flattering, and then waking to find the promise still sitting there in morning light, requesting a saucer of milk. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can follow along as we politely overinterpret ancient crushes. And if you drift off halfway through, that's fine. The stories know how to walk on tiptoe. If you happen to stay awake longer than expected, you may even subscribe for more gentle overinterpretation. No pressure, no runes required. Just the simple act of remembering there will be another night after this one. People like to start the chain of quiet causes with Freyr. He is the god who glows the way a field glows when a farmer says the harvest was decent, which is farmer language for my heart is dancing, but my boots are grounded. Freyr looked out and saw Gur, a giant's daughter who had land in her posture and winter in her gaze, and whose chest filled with that familiar weather, the feeling that distant hills are not nearly distant enough. He didn't shout. He didn't even sigh loudly. He sent his messenger Skirner to negotiate on his behalf, the way shy people send emails to important feelings. Skirner rode the horse that can step over fire, the way a careful person steps over laundry, and he took with him Freyr's sword, which could fight by itself if it had to, because some tools are like that, lifelong overachievers. The bargain was made. Gardens always approve of bargains made in winter, and Freyr, for love, gave away the sword. It is not exciting when it happens. It's tidy. A transfer of ownership. Later, when a giant named Surtur arrives with a blade that glows like a forge, rehearsing the sunrise, Freyr will meet him without his own weapon. The ending of that meeting is well known to people who plan for thick soups and long nights, but there's no need to hurry there. Tonight, it's enough to notice the scrap of arithmetic behind it, one soft yes now, exchanged for a fiercer no later. Love begins many ledgers. Another love that tilted a shelf was Loki's, if love is the right word for a pattern made of running water. His affection for Angraboa, the giantess in the ironwood, was a kind of forest weather, sometimes mist, sometimes a startling shaft of sun. Together they unwound 3 children from the roots of a complicated tree, Fenrir, Jarmungandr, and Hel, and tucked them into the corners of the world. It's more domestic than it sounds. A massive serpent still has to learn how to nap. A wolf still misjudges doorways. A queen of a quiet realm still decides whether to put the extra chairs in the cold room or the attic. The household of the future was raised like any household, with meals and minor repairs. The trouble is not that the children were strange. It's that every home improvement has a structural consequence. The sea serpent's coils taught sailors that horizons were not always patient. The wolf's shadow taught oaths to keep both eyes open. The queen's hall below the earth taught silence to move like water through stone. People will say later that this union spelled doom. It did not spell, it penciled. In the margins of history with neat handwriting, Frigg's love for her son is often told as a frantic errand, a mother gathering promises from all the things in the universe. Tonight is calmer. Imagine a queen with a list. She moves through the worlds, asking fire to be gentle, iron to be reasonable, stones to remember their manners, beasts to practice kindness. Most of them say yes because they have always liked her. She is the sort of person who returns borrowed tools clean. She stops short at a small plant, mistletoe, that seems too young for plans. The omission is not dramatic. It is the kind of oversight a human makes when they leave the house without their keys. Baldur's death, when it comes, spreads through Asgard like a rumor that turns out to be true. And the long road to winter is stretched by grief like dough that has risen too high and then collapses in the middle. Some speak of the chain of causes that leads from this loss to the final curtain call, but the chain is not iron. It is made of soft twine and circumstance. When people say love moves mountains, they do not always mention that mountains move very slowly, and mostly at night when no one is looking. A smaller tale small, like a spoon but useful every day, belongs to Sigyn. Her devotion to Loki becomes a quiet hinge in the great door. When he is bound with the clean efficiency of an unhappy committee, a serpent's venom drips above him with the patience of a leak in a ceiling. Sigyn stands with a bowl to catch it, and when she has to empty the bowl, the venom reaches him and the earth trembles with his shudder. Some treat those quakes as the taps of a metronome counting down to Ragnarok. That may be so, but the important part, for the mood of this evening, is that devotion can change the timing of the ground. Sigyn's arms are not literature. They're tired. She changes the world by minutes, the way someone changes a song by raising a needle and setting it back down, creating a soft extra syllable. If the end of things waits, even briefly, for her to return with the bowl, then the bowl is part of the clock. Even the mismatched marriage of Narj and Sky lends one button to the big coat. They try living in his sea home where gulls write messages on the air and the boards smell like clean salt. Sky dislikes it. The birds insist on clattering high notes against the roof, and the waves rehearse all night. They try living in her mountain hall where snow spells its thoughts out slowly, and the pine needles keep good records. Jar dislikes it. He dreams of oars and wakes to antlers. They part amicably, returning to the places where their bones make sense, but the experiment leaves traces, a little more caution in every alliance, a little more respect for regional weather. When gods practice compromises that don't hold, the world takes notes. Later, when alliances snap under larger weights, the old minutes will be consulted and someone will remark, with the calm of an archivist, that this has precedent. Some of these love stories make tidy explanations for later noise. Skalds, like competent accountants, enjoy balanced books. Freyr gives away a sword to win a hand, so he meets a flaming adversary empty-handed. Check. A mother misses one item on a list, so a single sprig plays the lead in a tragedy. Check. But tidy is not the same as true. The old poets also knew that the world prefers Messier math. Love was not merely the coin that bought catastrophe. It was also the thing that made the halls worth dusting. It lined the edges of benches with warmth. It encouraged hospitality to strangers who arrived with bad timing and good stories. Without love, the chronicles would be accurate and uninhabitable. With love, they are confusing and humane. If you are keeping score, you may pencil a small plus beside each minus, the same way a careful host puts 2 extra logs by the fire, just in case the story runs long. When people speak softly of Ragnarok over late bowls of stew, they do not blame these romances. They point to them with the politeness of a librarian showing you where the footnotes live. You can see Freyr's empty belt hook there, and the shadow of a misplant here, and Seijen's bowl warming in a sunbeam over there. They are not swords or storms. They are household objects that remember what they have seen. The end, when it eventually ambles over the hill like a weather system that received all its permissions long ago, will look strangely familiar because it will be built from familiars. Fields boats, a bowl, a clasp, a sprig, a promise. The unfamiliar part is simply the volume. It is the difference between a kettle boiling and the sea deciding to try that sound for itself. Desire doesn't end with the stories that made it into the public record. After the feast, when the last cup gives up a small argument with the table and settles, there are the private versions. The gods and giants and people in between kept a fog of letters that were never sent, and we only know them because the ravens occasionally dropped drafts into the wrong courtyard. There is the note a huntress wrote to a sea king where she tried to describe the smell of pine under snow without using the word pine or snow, because she had heard he preferred adjectives that had learned to swim. There is the message a sailor addressed to someone who might or might not be a goddess, explaining that he had discovered a new way to fold a blanket so that it kept two people warm without being obvious about it. There is the recipe passed from hand to hopeful hand for the cake that convinces a reluctant guest to stay through rain. None of these changed the fate of the worlds. They changed nights, which, to the people who lived those nights, was the same currency. Runes themselves have long been used as an excuse to whisper. Carved onto sticks or bones, they are the silent cousins of gossip, practical, secretive, fond of corners. Lovers cut them into the underside of benches, knowing that anyone who checked there would be sympathetic by definition. A common formula was the half compliment, half spell. May your footsteps be as heavy as your thoughts are light, which sounds cryptic until you realize it merely means come back safely, but don't hurry. The acorns kept track of these. Trees keep better secrets than stones because they understand growth as a kind of confidentiality. Each ring is a sealed envelope. If anyone ever asks you where the true archive of love resides, you can say it is in the patient wood of places where people rested. That is where desire's echoes live, humming along the grain. Some echoes are the kind that return after years and pretend they were always part of the furniture. There are the love affairs that never began because both participants were excellent at schedules. A goddess whose calendar was full of dawns and a man with sunsets booked. 3 months out agreed to admire each other from a distance convenient to their planners. Their restraint became a weather pattern over a small valley where farmers enjoyed unusually reliable seasons and never figured out why. There is also the long affection between a mountain and a particular cloud. The cloud visited most days, draped itself over the peak like a shawl, and then left. The mountain, which is not in a hurry, learned to think in vapor. And when, in the far future, fire runs along the ridges, the mountain will keep a small gift from the cloud in the form of cool pockets where animals pause and say, "Ah, yes, this place." The sagas are not obliged to include these romances. They were content to be local. Desire's most persistent echo is rumor, a kind that means well. People in Asgard often suspected that two others were fond of one another, not because of dramatic gestures, but because the hallway rugs began to wear in new places. You can learn a lot from a carpet. It knows who walks softly and who walks with purpose and who walks with purpose while pretending not to. Sometimes the rumor was correct. Sometimes the carpet was simply growing old. The calm wisdom here is that the world carries our possibilities as comfortably as our decisions. When one day the halls are empty and the rugs are rolled and stored, those places where footsteps lingered will still smell, faintly, of conversations that never became minutes. If you've ever opened an old book and felt the air inside behave like a shy animal, you know the feeling. We are told that the final season comes as a certainty, but certainty is not the same as abruptness. It approaches like a tide promised long ago, a tide that checked the pier every year and added instructions in the margins. Love Stories wrote many of those notes. They said, bring a lantern. The steps are uneven. They said, lean together on the windy parts. They said, remember where the rope is coiled. They said, if you drop something, it may wash up later with shells sticking to it, changed but cheerful. People who read those notes did not panic when the water finally arrived. They rolled their trousers, gave each other that look, which means, here we are then, and went on with the business of holding hands and carrying what could be carried. If you listen closely, an echo runs under the surf, not fear, simply recognition. The best thing about these quiet consequences is how unthreatening they are to sleep. None of them demand that you learn a hero's genealogy before bed. They ask you to remember smaller items, the way a clasp feels when it understands. Its job, the polite arrogance of mistletoe growing where it pleases the sigh a bowl makes when it settles into a palm for the 100th time. They invite you to keep a ledger of mild causality in which affection buys time, and patience earns interest, and even mistakes leave receipts that help someone make sense of a morning. If you're still with me, you might feel how every example returns the room to its first temperature. There are, of course, undisclosed matters. The gods are excellent at privacy when it comes wrapped in poetry. Odin is rumored to have stood under more than one unfamiliar roof, offering a name that was not the one he wore to breakfast, and listening to a lullaby not meant for him. The important part is not the intrigue, but the lullaby. Somewhere a child fell asleep to a rhythm that would someday steady the heart of a stranger at a crossroads. Freya is said to have taught a mortal how to speak to cats in the language of warm windowsills, and the skill passed down through a family until, years later, a warrior paused at the threshold of battle because a small gray creature blinked in a way he understood, and so a different story began. None of this is grand. It is domestic magic, the kind of thread that a world wears under its armor. By now, the air around us has learned the shape of the room again. The echo of desire has finished setting chairs exactly where it wants them, a little too close for scandal, a little too far for discomfort, perfect for conversation that trails off without ending. The bowl is caught, the clasp is fastened, the sword is wherever swords rest when they are absent. Outside, the horizon lies very still, practicing being a straight line. Inside, the carpets remember every person who crossed them gently. We could keep cataloging these small loves and their long shadows. There are so many. Like stars you notice only when the lamp is kind enough to dim, but the night has its own ledger to complete. If you wish, leave your eyes half open the way a cat pretends to be alert, and let the next sentence walk past without needing to be caught. Tomorrow, if you ask nicely, the stories will come back wearing the same quiet, and we can count the echoes again, one more time, until counting becomes the same thing as dreaming. You might not expect jealousy to make a sound, but in Asgard it has the softest footsteps. It moves like a draft under a door, the sort that barely flutters a candle and yet insists on being noticed. If the benches in the golden halls could speak, they'd tell you about it first. Little creaks whenever someone sits a touch farther from someone else than yesterday. The long, thoughtful sighs when cups are refilled, not quite as full as before. We are not here for scandal. We are here for that faint breeze, the hush between two names. If you're still awake a little later, you can subscribe to more quiet breezes, no horn blowing, just a secret handshake with the night. And if you fall asleep in the middle, the benches will hold your place. They are very good at saving seats for sleepers. The thing about Asgard is that every object is slightly opinionated. The wall hangings approve of symmetry, the shield rows enjoy telling. Time by smudges, and the floor rugs study patterns of boots like astrologers study stars. They notice when Freya passes in her necklace, and the light in the room stands up straighter. Or when Thor's laughter arrives too early and everyone remembers a joke they were not quite ready to laugh at. Jealousy doesn't burst into these rooms. It simply chooses a chair and watches. It watched, for instance, when Sif entered with her golden hair newly restored. Quiet minds wondered why it was so perfect, like sunlight that had been combed. The story is known, Loki and the dwarves and a knight with scissors, but what the rugs remember is smaller. How? For weeks afterward, Sif tied her hair with an extra knot as if to reassure it. Jealousy does not accuse. It measures knots dot in the side halls. The gods hang their traveling cloaks, and those cloaks keep better secrets than their owners. They have smelled river mist and forged smoke. They also know the scent of being left behind while a partner wanders. Odin's cloak could tell you about nights when it carried the weather of a dozen mortal hearths and returned smelling of questions. Frigg never counted smells. She counted promises. She had a list for everything, and it was beautifully written. The list of what will not harm a beloved son, for example, was a masterpiece of tidy diplomacy. Jealousy sat quietly at the edge of that list like a bookmark, not because Frigg was jealous of anything in particular, but because attention itself can be mistaken for rivalry. Attention is keen-eyed and thorough. Jealousy, overhearing, tries to imitate those qualities and ends up being suspicious with good posture. Freya's jewel, the Brisingamen, is often treated as a trophy, but tonight it is a calendar. Every time she fastens it, the clasp remembers the temperature of her skin, the hour of the evening, the mood of the mead. People whispered about how she acquired it. This is what people do when they are offered craftsmanship beyond the usual brackets, but the clasp is not interested in intrigue. It records hugs. It also records those moments when a room adjusts itself because she sat beside one person instead of another. Jealousy is fond of such adjustments. It is the geometry of closeness, the arithmetic of glances. You can feel it in a hall the way you can feel the precise location of a cat you cannot see. Somewhere your eyes are not. A contented weight makes furniture meaningful. The jealousy of Asgard is rarely the loud kind. It prefers small games of placement. Take the time Thor mislaid his hammer. Yes, there were giants and a ransom and a dress involved, but the jealousy was in the seating chart afterward. Who sat near Thor at the feast once the hammer returned? Who toasted him first and who waited? The hammer itself does not mind. It likes anyone with a grip and a purpose. But hammers have long memories of who claimed to be unconcerned in the hour of absence, and who looked at the doorway every time a breeze suggested hope. Jealousy does not enjoy theft. It enjoys the quiet inventory that follows. Sometimes jealousy surfaces in the most ordinary places, like the line for apples. Idun's fruit keeps everyone brisk in the joints and bright in the eyes, and no one complains about the queue because the basket smells like clean mornings. Yet even there you can taste the question in the air. Who was given an extra apple last time and why? Idun's habit is to top up the baskets of the ones who look tired rather than the ones who look important, and nothing diffuses jealousy faster than that. If you're designing a world, consider adding one person who refills things sensibly. It's the mythological equivalent of labeling your leftovers. It prevents midnight confusion in the workshops below, where the dwarves hit metal until it remembers its best self. Jealousy has a different sound. It's the moment when one craftsman looks at another's finish and says nothing, which is high praise. Asgard's halls borrowed that silence. When Loki arrived wearing a grin borrowed from trouble, the silence chewed on it politely, and then resumed watching. People like to say that Loki causes jealousy wherever he steps, but that gives him too much credit. He's more like a traveling mirror, handing everyone a pocket-sized reflection and wandering off before the angle is settled. The jealousy was already present, just quieter, a little shy about asking for directions. Mortals who visited the halls noticed the calm and assumed there was no rivalry at all. The way a child assumes that grown-ups don't argue because dinner is already on the table. But the cooks know better. In Asgard's kitchen, jealousy lives. Near the spice shelf, which is crowded the way a good shelf is, it watches the cook choose thyme instead of dill, and wonders if dill has done something unspeakable. It sees a platter heading one direction and another platter revising its plan, and it assumes there's a story there. Often there isn't, and that is jealousy's second most important lesson. More than half of its suspicions are polite fiction. The first lesson is that fiction can still nudge a cup a little farther from a plate, just in case. They're human. Analogies everywhere, because the gods invented people by practicing being people. Heimdall hears grass grow and can therefore hear sulk in the dark. Tyr gave his hand to a wolf and learned that trust has sharp paperwork. Scotty wants mountains, Jar wants waves. Every marriage counselor since has used them as a chapter. Heading titled, "You Both Have Points." Jealousy doesn't dislike any of this. It takes notes like a scholar and then curls up in a window seat. It especially enjoys festivals when judgments are passed on poetry and archery and hairstyles. The audience claps evenly because Asgard likes to keep tempers at a simmer rather than a boil. And jealousy purrs at this, delighted by the tiny comparisons that never grow up into quarrels. You might ask whether jealousy ever becomes useful. Asgard says yes, in the way a well-tuned instrument can make you sit straighter. A touch of envy made the gods better hosts. Cups were filled promptly because no one wanted to be the one who forgot. Doors were held, seats offered, the smaller fire stoked, the extra cloak loaned. If a praise song lingered too long on one name, someone would remember a second verse for someone else. This is not virtue so much as good housekeeping, but good housekeeping is polite heroism. It keeps the air breathable when stories go on past bedtime, which they do, and here we are, together with the lanterns low. Of course, sometimes the draft under the door does more than stir a candle. We promise no drama tonight, so the great betrayals will stand outside on the porch where the night is cool. But we can mention the little ones, the missed meetings, the vows that slid an inch because a day was long and someone was charming. Broken promises seldom shatter in Asgard. They bend like the tine of a fork that lives a useful life afterward with a tiny wobble. People remember, because remembering is what people do when they share mead and rugs and weather. They remember, and they adjust, and the hall learns a new arrangement for chairs. One such adjustment lives in the sound of a door closing softly. It belongs to a friend who stopped visiting as often when a golden-haired goddess began to sit by another friend. No one said anything saying things is for sagas with drums, but the door learned the music of absence and hummed it whenever the wind helped. Another adjustment lives in the way Odin praised a verse without looking at the poet, because looking might pin something in place that was better left loose. These are not crimes. They are the modest civil engineering of feeling. Bridges rated for two now, rated for one, and everyone carried lighter loads across them, and the world held. If you're awake enough for a footnote, there is also the jealousy of objects for their owners. Gungnir prefers Odin's hand, but agrees to be admired by competent archivists. The ships like their captains regular as tides. Even the cats that draw Freya's chariot have opinions about who gets to touch the harness. When a tool or a beast feels overlooked, jealousy politely sharpens the edge or the burr, a reminder to treat relationships with a cloth and oil. If this sounds like a maintenance schedule, it is, and that is exactly what the end of the world will be built upon: neglected maintenance. A story doesn't collapse because of one terrible moment. It collapses because all the small tightenings were postponed. Jealousy, if listened to, can be a little wrench. The halls also teach how quietly jealousy can be soothed. A hand on a shoulder that lingers the necessary heartbeat, an invitation phrased in the guest's language rather than the host's, a compliment designed like a good door, sturdy, useful, easy to open again. The gods are ancient and grand, but even they respond to the most mortal kindness of all beings seen in the small hour. Jealousy, having had its say, folds itself into a neat square and tucks beneath a cushion. It will be back. Cushions are practical that way, yet every time it returns, it finds the room rearranged by Grace Dot. By now the rugs have finished their listening, and the cups have decided how empty to be. Outside, the sky is practicing that pale edge which belongs to mornings. Inside, jealousy has curled in the corner like a satisfied cat, and the broken promises, those thin, bendable ones, are lying flat under a book to smooth. We could list every quiet story from every corridor, but the night prefers a shorter index. Feel free, if you're still awake, to subscribe to nothing in particular, just the art of noticing when a chair moves an inch. If your eyes are heavy, give them the gift of closing. The halls will keep their gentle inventory without you. The draft under the door will continue counting, patient and almost purring, and when tomorrow comes, it will carry the same soft news. In Asgard, even jealousy uses its inside voice. You might not think fate could be nudged by something as small as a promise made on a ring that smells faintly of pocket linen and pine resin, but in the north they swear it can. O's like that were not thunderclaps. They were warm metal, a thumb running along a groove that had been worn by years of worry, and a quiet yes that seemed almost too quiet to change the shape of anything. The gods preferred it that way. They liked destiny to arrive softly with the same politeness as a second cup of mead. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can follow this sleepy trail into other promises. There's no sign-up form, only the ritual of not snoring too loudly over the interesting bits. And if you drift off, the ring will keep listening. Rings are patient listeners. It's what makes them circular. There were oath rings at the temples, great bands of gold that had their own social lives. In winter, they wore a coat of frost like a silver beard. In summer, they warmed under the touch of a dozen forearms and grew philosophical. During the blot, when the smoke wandered upward in a slow, thoughtful line, the ring would be anointed with sacrificial blood and lifted for swearing. People would place their hands upon it and speak a vow in the even voice reserved for weather. Reports and wedding toasts. The gods had their own rings, of course. Odin wore Draupnir, the gentle bracelet that solved gift-giving by making more of itself every ninth night. The ring's copies had the temperament of bread rolls, uncomplaining, dependable, and occasionally toasted. It is difficult to shout while wearing an object that repeats itself by patience, so the gods spoke their promises softly, as if not to embarrass the metal with passion. One evening, when candle stubs looked like little white trees in snow, the talk in Asgard drifted from raids to renovations. The wall around the home of the gods needed work. Stones had slouched. Frost had touched seams. Even the gate hinge had learned to clear its throat before opening. The gods discussed contractors, as people have always done, whether to hire locally, whether references matter more than price, whether the phrase, by the first day of summer, has ever meant the same thing to two people. A stranger arrived. With an offer so tidy, the benches leaned forward. Yes, he could build the whole fortification. Yes, before the deadline. Yes, alone well with his horse. There was a price, but prices are small in the mouth and large in the ledger. He wanted Freya and the sun and the moon. The hall hummed like a beehive reading a contract. Now, a promise can be a kind of furniture arrangement. You slide a chair to one side to make room for the idea that it will actually happen, and soon your bed is at a new angle, and the moon keeps falling into a different window. The gods promised to pay if the work was finished on time, and the stranger promised to finish on time. They added a clause because nothing makes a bargain feel safer than a clause that is very specific. The builder must do it without help, alone, except for the horse, who did not count because a horse is more enthusiasm than person. This is how small exceptions lean close to fate and whisper, just between us. The horse, Svalfari, turned out to be more than enthusiasm. He was a daily miracle of logistics, a four-legged crane who hauled stones with a cheerfulness that made the boulders feel chosen. The wall rose so serenely that everyone began to practice the bright smile of people about to pay a price they don't have, like travelers approaching a toll bridge with a beautiful view and only 3 coins. Freya sharpened her glare to a fine point. The sun adjusted its schedule, and the moon took notes. Promises tugged at their leashes. In the final week, the wall needed only a few more courses of stone, and someone needed to think of something. When a contract begins to feel inevitable, some people turn to lawyers. The gods turn to Loki, who's many things, and, when necessary, a clause with legs. This is not a story of chase and shout. That version has hooves and distance and a berth in a stable. Tonight, quietly, just imagine a horse stepping away from the building site because the evening smelled like something he hadn't yet learned, and the builder, who loved the horse with the entire attention of his work, following. The unfinished stones rested like a breath held halfway. Morning arrived to find the wall unready and the promise unfulfilled. If you listen closely, you can hear the hinge clearing its throat in relief. The gods kept their home, and the stranger kept a story he would not tell at dinner. To say they broke a promise is technically correct in the way saying a frost rearranged a roof is correct. The gods had agreed to a method that suddenly, through the unscheduled education of a horse, changed categories. What actually changed was the current of fate, which had been running downhill toward payment and turned aside like a stream. Discovering a stone, this is how softly destinies can tilt. A vow, a clause, a horse with his mind on something else, and a wall that would outlast warm years and cold, keeping drafts in their place and gossip near the fire. The gods thanked their luck aloud and their wit in smaller voices. Somewhere, a ring felt the brief cool of a promise stepping away and drew a quiet circle around that space so future oaths would remember the size of such decisions. Elsewhere, in a room that had learned the patient vocabulary of longing, Freyr sat with his head in his hand and his sword not in his hand. It rested alone, leaning like a faithful dog waiting by the wrong door. Freyr had fallen for Gur, whose name itself moves like someone opening a gate. Love in Asgard usually smelled like wood smoke and rain on wool and involved practical questions about travel. Here, it smelled like the space between 2 fence posts when you can see the world more clearly because of the distance. Freyr sent his man Skirnir to arrange a meeting, and Skirnir, who was good at errands that required both threats and poetry, asked for the sword as payment. It was the sort of trade people make while distracted, like swapping a winter coat for a photograph of spring. Freyr promised himself it would be fine. Internal promises are the quietest kind and sometimes the most expensive. The scabbard, left behind, became a second room. It held the shape of something that should have been there, and rooms noticed such things. Over days and seasons, the empty scabbard learned patience, which is a kind of courage with no parade. Freyr's meetings with Gur were a long time coming because the heart believes in calendars that the earth has never authorized. 9 nights, said the message, a number that looks tidy as stacked logs. He waited, and while he waited, he told himself that a god who gives up a sword has not lost a weapon but graduated from it, like a swimmer moving beyond the dock. We tell ourselves such stories because they allow us to sleep. On the 9th night, they met, and every apple in the orchard turned its face toward them the way people at a cafe collectively orient themselves toward a dog. The promise seemed fulfilled. The scabbard at home felt several pounds lighter, which is a remarkable trick for leather, but love, which rearranges furniture cheerfully, does not often consult future wars. A day would come when Freyr would want the sword again, and find that it had continued its career with someone else. Fate is not vindictive, it's simply an accurate bookkeeper. The absence of that sword did not shout. It simply stood nearby during certain conversations and looked like the empty chair of a friend who moved away. Much later, on a field with hard wind and disobedient clouds, the price presented itself like a bill passed under a door. In retellings full of trumpets, this is dramatic. In our quiet version, it is merely the truth that a small promise to oneself, yes, I can do without, can become the hinge of an age. If you have ever lent a favorite umbrella and then found yourself under an unambitious drizzle, you understand, respectfully scaled down. Sometimes a promise doesn't bend fate so much as teach it to walk differently. Take the marriage between Jar and Skati, a set of vows signed by geography. She liked mountains that kept their thoughts to themselves. He liked the sea, which does not stop talking. They agreed to live 9 nights in one place and 3 in the other, which is the exact proportion for ensuring that both people feel slightly robbed while trying to appear gracious. Their houses were competent negotiators. In the mountains, Njár admired Metal quiet, while noticing that quiet has a long list of small sounds, especially when you are trying to nap. The wolves in the distance had opinions. The waterfall rehearsed. The wind had a collection of spoons. By the sea, Skati enjoyed the horizon the way a tidy person enjoys an empty desk. While discovering that Gauls hold meetings in public without agendas, they kept their promise until the promise began to keep them. They did not shout about it, and they did not accuse one another of taste crimes. They simply learned the topography of each other's smiles and decided gently that sometimes a vow fulfilled still misses the point. Is that a broken promise? The oath ring would say no. The vow was given a complete tour. But fate, taking notes in the corner with a respectful cough, agreed to do something different for both of them thereafter. Their story is used by counselors and cartographers alike. Not all maps should be folded together, dotted the thing. Half parliament, half picnicos were sworn on rings before serious business was arranged in pleasantly long sentences. If you have ever signed a new phone contract that includes weather, family, and 3 newsletters you didn't mean to get, you have the idea. Men and women promise to guard alliances, to return horses, to witness fairly, to carry news without decoration. Some promises were kept with elegance, which is to say invisibly. Some were kept with creaks and improvisations. A few became stories. The one about the man who vowed to bring back a borrowed cauldron but returned a slightly different cauldron, and a story about how the old cauldron had a baby, that sort of story. The gods listened because mortal promises behave like weather. Fronts. They drift upward and become climate. There is another promise worth mentioning. Not because it was broken, but because it refused to break for so long that fate had to grow around it. Loki, secured beneath the earth, was fastened there with the wire of his own family grief, which is the sort of chain that never needs polishing. Above him, a serpent dripped venom with the schedule-keeping zeal of an unpaid intern. Seijen knelt, holding a bowl to catch the falling drops, which is the most. Domestic heroism possible, a person, a container, a schedule. When the bowl filled, she rose to empty it, and the moment of absence stung. Then she returned. Over and over, a choreography of care. The softest promise in Asgard performed until the world kept time with it. If a myth becomes a lullaby, it is. Because someone agreed to do a small kind thing repeatedly. In that sense, Seijen's vow altered fate by sanding its edges. Jealousies dulled themselves near her. Quarrels respected the floorboards. Meanwhile, oaths about treasure continued to shape quiet districts of destiny. Freya's necklace had its own chain of stories as long as winter nights, and with every retelling, someone made a new moral out. Of older metal was the promise she made to acquire a contract, an art commission, or an instance of very determined shopping. The answer depended on the hour of need and who had just lost at dice. What mattered to fate was that the clasp of the necklace felt the heat of her skin day after day, and small changes followed. Envy became less noisy, admiration learned to be practical, and lovers, seeing how jewelry could become geography, began to imagine gifts that would triangulate their affections. Rings noticed this trend with polite interest. The gods understood that promises have seasons. Spring oaths are energetic and sometimes overwatered. Summer oaths sun themselves and grow cozy. Autumn oaths put on sweaters and review their budgets. Winter oaths hold still and decide if they are truly evergreen. A vow made at a feast might not fit as well during a journey. A pact struck by torchlight can feel overly dramatic at breakfast. So the wise kept editing. Odin, who had worn enough oaths to know which ones chafed in the rain, developed a way of nodding that meant both yes and think about it. Frigg kept lists titled things that need another look, written in a neat hand. Tyr, who had traded a hand to keep a promise that a certain wolf would be bound, placed a quiet finger from his remaining hand upon any new agreement and felt for wobble. Even Thor, who solved many problems by lifting them, learned to ask, "Will this promise live well in a storm?" It is a surprisingly useful question, even if your storm is 3 emails and a missing sock dot every so often, Oathring learned. A new word. Once it learned patience, once it learned pardon. On a thoughtful night it learned afterward, which is the name for the long meadow beyond any vow. The meadow is full of outcomes, some expected, some a little off to one side, as if they wandered away to look at blackberries. The broken promises that changed fates are all there, but they are not scandalous. They are a kind of carpentry, choices that altered angles so subtly that no one noticed until morning sun hit a wall differently and made a new patch of floor glow. The builder's almost finished wall, the sword that went exploring, the marriage that lived in 2 competent houses, the bowl that kept catching drops. These are the joinery of the world. If you are tempted to test your own vows against the ring's quiet shine, the night encourages you to keep it small. Promise to water the plant. Promise to answer the letter. Promise, if you're still awake, to subscribe to the gentle sport of noticing which promises grow softer when whispered. And if your eyes are already closing, make the tiniest vow, that you will let the story keep speaking without you for a while. The ring does not mind. It remembers the warmth of many wrists, and it knows how to hold a promise lightly enough that it can breathe. The gods' fates will keep rearranging themselves with that slow, satisfying sound a heavy curtain makes when you draw it, the one that separates day from night. Somewhere a scabbard waits with dignified optimism, somewhere a hinge stretches, somewhere a cup is being turned so that the rim meets a mouth at exactly the right moment. And beyond these rooms, the meadow of afterward spreads out, calm as a long exhale, full of the footprints of promises that mattered because they were small, and the ones that slipped a little and taught destiny to walk a different, kinder path. You wouldn't think the end of the world could trace its steps back to something as cozy as people liking each other, but in the north, the road to Ragnarok is paved with crushes, courtships, and complicated conversations about where to keep one's shoes. The sagas love to talk about swords and storms, yet when you listen closely, destiny changes tone whenever somebody blushes. It is almost polite about it, like a kettle clearing its throat before it sings. If you're still awake, in a little while, you can follow these very gentle love stories as they drift like snowflakes toward the long winter evening the skalds warned about. And if you drift off before then, that's all right too. The stories are patient and will keep their scarves on. In the meantime, you can place your ear to the quiet. It sounds like two people talking very softly at the edge of a feast, promising to write. Odin's house kept a serious calendar, but even a serious calendar has room for personal errands. Among the errands was the matter of Balder, love for reasons that were not dramatic at all. He was simply tidy with his kindness, the sort who remembers the names of the geese. Frigg loved him with the particular focus of someone who knows every drawer in a kitchen and which one is always a little stuck. When Balder began to dream of harm, Frigg spoke to almost everything in the world and asked it to behave one by one, in a tone you might use with a mischievous cupboard. Please don't. Fall on my son. Stones promised, fire promised. Illnesses, metals, even the bees that sometimes take offense when you walk past their decisions, each promised. She missed the mistletoe because it was young and looked like a plant still working out its fonts. The love that forgets one tiny thing is still love. It is, in fact, the standard model. In the Great Hall, the gods began the habit of throwing objects at Balder to watch them refuse to hit him. A polite sport like darts played with consent, applause, and light refreshments. Somewhere in the side room of fate, a mistletoe twig took notes. The day the twig finally spoke, it did not shout. It simply straightened itself. The story that followed is usually told with suddenness, but at bedtime we can slow it until you can count the stitches on Frick's sleeve. The arrow flew, the room inhaled. Kindness left a silhouette where Balder had been, like the pale shape of a painting after it is removed from a sunny wall. Nanna, who loved Balder as people love warm bread in a house with open windows, sat beside him and felt her heart follow him into the silence with the calm confidence of a tethered boat slipping its knot. The gods gathered their voices as people do after dropping a bowl, all speaking softly because the loudness would be too much. In Hell's Hall, a bargain glimmered, the kind that asks everyone to weep. Love tried to organize a group project. It was nearly successful, almost. There was that one quiet figure who didn't cry. It is not for us to name him tonight. We only notice the stillness that resisted the tide. From that day, Frigg's love turned into a thread that kept tugging at the sleeve of destiny, reminding it to check the time. The end did not hurry toward them, it strolled. But its shoes made a new sound on the floor. Odin's love also made plans. It reached toward Reinder, a giantess with a winter's patience, and from their strange, deliberate meeting came Vali, born to set one wrong thing slightly straighter. Vali grew in a single day, the way a thought grows when you finally give it a table and a chair. He took one step, then another, and a justice the size of a handprint returned to the world. It did not repair all things. It stitched one seam where the fabric had been stretched. Odin's feeling for knowledge, which is one of his ways of loving, had already given the world a new schedule by placing an eye in the well. Now his feelings for family placed a quiet certainty in the path ahead. If you ask destiny what shapes it, destiny will tell you the same answer as gardeners: water, light, and who stands seeing you. Loki's life did not present itself as a bouquet. It came as a handful of wildflowers blooming in surprising places, often where you were sure you had planted nothing. In the iron forests of the east, his heart found Angerboa, and together they became a constellation of consequences disguised as children. Jormungandr went to the sea and discovered that circles are the best lullabies. Hel went below and learned how to keep a kingdom, with gentle firmness and a seating chart that always included the unexpected guest. Fenrir grew in the courtyard like a winter storm rehearsing its lines. We are told this is a terrible family. It is also a family that spent its early years like any other, with meals that didn't entirely work, with stories that made somebody laugh from the wrong end of the room, with the simple pride of noticing how tall someone has grown. The gods visited and nodded gravely. They mended the furniture afterward. They loved too in their way. That complicated, worried love that chooses a strong chain because it is afraid of what the world will do to the ones that could break it. If you've ever baby-proofed a house so thoroughly you created an obstacle course, you understand the logic. Love wasn't absent. It was merely constitutional. If you were still awake, you might notice how every affection here carries a little calendar in its pocket. 9 nights keep reappearing like polite crows. When Freyr fell for Gur, he gave up his sword to his messenger Skirnir, as casually as someone lending a favorite pen without quite looking at whom they gave it to. His love wasn't loud. It was a steady light in the next field over. Heh, waited the appointed nights while trees learned each other by heart. Love arrived exactly when it said it would, which is a rare event even among deities. The price, though, had already stepped into place with its shoes perfectly tied. The sword chose a new story. Freyr's hands learned to shape peace in the air where it used to be. No one measured a disaster that day. It was just one of those elegant choices that looks beautiful until the weather changes. On a certain distant plain in a colder time, the lack would draft the schedule. The space where a blade should have been would invite another ending. We are not there yet. We're in the orchard where 2 people meet and the apples notice the posture of joy. In Asgard, the marriages were practical tools as often as they were poems. Jar and Sky pledged themselves with an itinerary. 9 nights by the sea, then 3 in the mountains, and the pattern again. The way you might alternate sides of the bed for fairness without telling the cat. Their affection was quiet, respectful, and full of small experiments. Sky brought her snowshoes and her opinion about gulls. Jar brought the sea's way of telling stories that take a whole day to end. They tried. That is a mighty verb, and it is woven into every ending. Later, when the cold finally asked its final question, the mountains and the sea would each remember, having been part of the same household, and permit the long tides and long snows to meet without anger. The vow did not fail, exactly. It aged into the kind of truce that leaves good cutlery behind. There are also those delicate, starlit loves that involve vows and a small amount of homework. Consider the walkings and watchings between Heimdall and the world he listens to, the affection of the watcher for the thing watched. He loves the bridges he names at dawn, the hush of frost on Bifrost before anyone else has stepped there. He promised once to hear the grass grow, an offer so extreme that most people would have accepted politely and forgotten. Heimdall did not forget. This is why, when secrets move like mice along the beams of the world, a horn waited for the right breath. Love kept that horn polished. He did not posture, he cleaned. He arranged. He said, "Not now yet," and kept saying it for a very long time. By then you can hear fate humming the old tunes. Love has a way of making introductions the world will be living with for centuries. Take Saijin, who loved Loki with the deep practicality of someone who keeps spare bowls. Her devotion did not empty the venom. It made a pattern out of the drops, and the pattern, repeated, taught the ground to steady itself beneath a future shaking. When people speak of earthquakes and chains, they usually forget the rhythm that has already been set by care. Even Doom benefits from choreography. It chooses its steps more thoughtfully when someone nearby is counting. If we wander into the Great Hall again, late in the evening after the benches have grown friendly, we can see how all these attachments became the stitchwork that held the they're in the right shape. There's Frigg forever adjusting the blanket of safety, tucking it around any child who passes near her reach. There's Freya with her necklace that glows like a well-kept secret, reminding everyone that wanting is a kind of prayer that uses the whole body. There's Thor with his simple, stubborn fondness for anyone who smiles at him. He would build a barn for a stranger who lends him a good word. These two are love stories that move the great clock a little. When the serpent would later stir, it would be unwinding a hug it had given itself for comfort. When Fenrir would eventually open his mouth, the gods would remember how wide a mouth must be to sing lullabies to a moon. And when a ship cut from the nails of the dead finally tipped the wind it had waited for, the wind itself would remember the lovers who once crossed a fjord by its patience and asked them silently to forgive the weather that it helps, while slanting towards sleep to count the small domestic items that lean against these larger tailies. A ring resting in a dish on a bedside table that knows the shape of two hands. A scabbard that remembers the blade it was asked to keep safe and wonders in a well-mannered way whether it has failed at housekeeping. A comb hung beside a door, because a certain person likes to tidy their hair before going out to look at the horizon. The end of the world, when it comes, will open drawers like these and find them full of receipts for tenderness. The receipts do not cancel the bill, but they change the accounting from cruel to careful. Even the final winter, Fimbul, has the feel of blankets added one by one. A thoughtful cold that means business but still avoids drafts. People sometimes ask when Ragnarok really begins. The poets who enjoy an entrance point to a horn and a ship and a wolf. The housekeepers of destiny give a different answer. They say it starts when you love someone or something enough to put it in the same sentence as your future, because from that moment your future will feel a bit responsible. Freyr did that the day he looked across a fence of light and decided to be a person with fewer weapons and more orchards. Frigg did it the morning she visited the small things and secured their promises. She believed the world could be arranged to be kind. Loki and Angerboa did it when they kept a home in a forest that had its own ideas about guests. The gods are not so unlike us. The end of their world will be a family event with the sort of attendance issues, old jokes, and complicated seating that make reunions tender and tiring. If you're awake, you can almost hear the invisible aunties of fate clinking plates in the kitchen, saying, "It will be fine, we have enough dot, and still the night strokes everything smooth." Frigg, in some remembered summer, reaches to fix the tilt of Baldur's crown of hair, and for a moment the world is exactly the size of a mother's hand. Freyr walks the tree line and practices being unarmed, and discovers that the crickets are very brave. Jar falls asleep to waves counting themselves. Skaki wakes in the dark and listens to a fox learn new opinions. Seijen turns the bowl. Again, Heimdall breathes in and out, and once more in. Freya fastens the clasp and thinks of names. Somewhere the serpent shifts its long loop, and the sea thinks, "Ah yes, the old song," and hums. You might fall asleep here, if you like, in the middle of all these minor vows and practical gifts, because this is the honest part of the prophecy, the quiet labor of love that makes even an ending arrive with its shirt tucked in. If your eyes are heavy, you can promise to keep just one corner of one of these stories in mind tomorrow, like saving a crust of bread for the birds. If you are still listening, imagine how many letters destiny keeps in its pockets, written by hands that smelled of pine or salt or soap. None of them end with a flourish. Most of them say the same thing: "I will be there as best I can." That sentence, more than any spear or spell, shapes the road that leads the gods toward their evening. It does not rush them. It does not even insist. It is simply a path on which shoes have been worn smooth by visiting and returning and visiting again. The path runs past your bed, quiet as wool, and on toward a field where all the large events will occur at the pace of weather. The field is not ready yet. Someone is still setting chairs. Someone is folding a cloak. Someone is counting to 9 patiently, because that is the number love chose to get its breath. And in this long, softly lit interval before the last dawn, grows curious, the world keeps doing the kind of loving that looks small from a distance and enormous from the pillow. The kind that shapes not just an ending, but the manners of the end, so that even Ragnarok, when it finally knocks, will wipe its feet. You might expect the loudest loves to be the ones the skalds remembered, yet in the north, the soft ones linger longer, like steam on a wooden cup in winter air. Tonight we follow the very quiet kind, the feelings that never became a boast, that hid in braids and sleeve hems and lingered in the rafters after the torches were pinched out. It's a sleepy subject, the echo of desire that never asked to be written down, only to be noticed and then kindly set aside. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can follow along. And if you drift off, that's fine to consider. It's a traditional Norse approach to confidentiality. If you happen to subscribe while half asleep, even better. The ravens will file the paperwork for me, very discreet. And frankly, they've been looking for something relaxing to do after the feasts. When benches exhaled and the mead horns were tucked like sleeping geese, Asgard practiced the art of not making a sound. There is a particular hush to a hall that has finished laughing. Shields hung on the walls kept their round, watchful faces. The gold on them cooled to its evening color, that mellow shade you might call candle peel. Someone, usually a careful hand from Frigg's household, went around with a small whisk broom, murmuring to crumbs. The echoes of the day arranged themselves into tidy piles, and inside those echoes, like seeds in the chaff, lay unspoken affections. They weren't dramatic. Everyone had a business-like understanding of love during business hours. But at night, a different kind of gravity worked, the low pull that draws two thoughts together across a long table. Odin's chair sat slightly askew, as if it had let itself remember a conversation. Frigg's key ring slept on its nail with a posture that suggested she would be back soon. You could almost hear the house thinking of the people it held, and you knew somehow that the house loved them in its way. The poets liked to put kennings on everything sea as whale road, battle as spear storm, but they never settled on a good phrase for this gentle remainder of desire. It was less than a vow and more than a whim. It was the sense that a person's name fit very nicely in the mouth, and you enjoyed saying it to yourself while pouring water. Heimdall noticed it, of course. He noticed everything except perhaps himself. He could hear grass grow in secrets, tiptoe, and on some evenings he could tell which Valkyrie was thinking of which hero by the way her steps rounded off at the heel. That sounds intrusive, but he kept it like a lighthouse keeps ships by making no fuss at all. The night had administrators like that, Heimdall filing what he heard under tender, non-urgent, the moon arranging his light so that a person could see a hand without being caught using it, and not the night herself carrying a quilt of shadow big enough to cover even the most expansive emotions without judgment. If you've ever put a sweater over a chair because the room felt shy, you already know her method. Ravens who pretend to be strictly professional were in fact the night's busiest romantics. Hugin and Minin made a study of unmailed thoughts. The way bakers study weather, they learned the particular temperature at which a sigh becomes a decision and the wind direction that makes a promise lean toward the door. Often, after circling Midgard, they brought Odin news that had nothing to do with spears or kings. They reported the little things, who lingered at a bridge for no reason, who traced runes on their own palm and hid the hand in a pocket as if it were a bird. Odin listened as if these details were part of some greater strategy, and perhaps they were. Even a god of war knows that alliances begin as friendships, which begin as shared cups, which begin as "you look tired, sit here." Some loves never introduced themselves at all. They preferred choreography. A Valkyrie would loosen a single braid before flying out and later tighten it again, satisfied. Somewhere a farmer in Midgard woke from a dream with his hand half raised, as if greeted from far above. No scandal there. Only the sort of recognition that glows like fish scales and then slides back under the water. The hall understood. Benches, scooted closer than their measurements would allow. A bench that has seen centuries of sitting develops opinions. These benches approved of kind glances and steady hands. And if the stories mention battles more than benches, well, the benches were very modest about their matchmaking. Once you begin to listen for them, these quiet affections appear in places the official histories forgot to dust. There's a famous story about Freya and her necklace, the Brisingamen, which arrived by methods the polite seldom review at dinner. The soft echo of that story is simpler. Someone looked at Freyja and wanted to make a circle of light big enough to hold everything she wanted. But dwarves did not say this aloud, of course. They expressed it with metal, their best language, and links so smooth that the fingers wearing it could not feel where one ended and another began. Freya, who understood workmanship and wanting, wore the piece the way a person wears memory comfortably. Sometimes the necklace rested on a windowsill to cool and watch two distant figures walk along the shore, arguing lightly about whose turn it was to carry the basket. The necklace did not interrupt. Jewelry is a good listener. The sea kept its own catalog of these things. Sailors confided in it without realizing, and the tide stored what it heard in neat ripples. When a man or woman stood on a headland and thought of someone at home, the sea moved a little toward them, as if trying to look around their shoulder and see the person too. Jar knew this was happening, but never gave a lecture. He loved efficient currents and the way a small wave breaks into letters no one has yet learned to read. Far inland, where the sea could not quite reach, brooks tried their hand at the same art, spelling with pebbles. Thor, whose public manner involved hammers and weather adjustments, went walking by these little streams at dusk and let them talk. He didn't mind a love story that didn't involve him. He was fond of any tale in which someone kept their word and someone else baked bread. In the Iron Forest, Angerbow's house remembered a different category of affection, the one expressed by taking up space together without apology. Loki built a fire that cracked and wandered the way his mind did, and she put on the kind of soup that requires no permission to continue simmering all afternoon. Between them, Desire behaved as any practical guest might. It went to fetch more firewood and returned with several ideas about future conversations. Later, the world would call their children omens, which is one way to miss the obvious fact that omens also track mud on the floor and ask for second helpings. The echo of that home remained even after everyone had to go their separate mythologies. It lingered in the smell of pine pitch and iron, in the sturdy place at the edge of a table where you might set your elbow and not feel rushed down in Hell's Country. Where the long quiet learns its finest manners, Desire took on an archival role. The dead arrived with pockets full of unfinished letters, the sort you write in your head while stirring a pot. And Hell, who has the calm of someone who has seen every possible expression settle into something restful, gave those letters shelves. There were not many dramatic secrets on those shelves. There were recipes with notes in the margins addressed to a person who had moved away. There were small drawings of someone's hands. There were runes scratched on birch that said nothing more than "Leave the lamp, I'm reading." Hell kept them. All she knows that even half sentences are complete feelings. When Balder came, the light in the hall improved, the way light improves when someone opens a window while you thought there weren't any. And the letters looked up from their shelves. They didn't ask to be read. They were content being near. Someone gentle. Some nights, the echoes rose from the ground like fog and drifted across the drawbridge where the guardian maiden, Majid, stood with her lantern and her impassive excellency. She noted the passing wishes and posted them, not to heaven or back to earth, but to the blank in between that all unspoken things share. It is peaceful there, the way the space under a bed is peaceful if you have remembered to sweep. Ombre still. Evenings the lantern reflected twice in the river, and Maju would like to imagine the reflections were two people at a door, deciding whether to say the brave part out loud or keep it for tomorrow's better lighting. She understands hesitation. She is, after all, the threshold's best friend. The Norns did not pretend to be romantic, yet their loom caught more of these whispers than any song. While they set the big patterns, crown, mountain, storm, they tucked in embroidery only they would notice. A spray of barley for a man who paused every evening to wave at his neighbor's children. A braided knot for two women in different towns who taught each other songs by sending travelers back and forth. A small dog-shaped loop for a young person who hadn't yet found the word for the warmth they felt when a certain blacksmith laughed. Occasionally Ord, who remembers in Verdandi, who attends the present like a midwife, and Skuld, who thinks a little in advance, exchanged a look that said, "Yes, keep it." The weave held Dot up above. Mani the moon had mastered the slow pan. He could move a beam of light a finger's width to make a doorway look kinder, or brighten the frost on a path, so that even a shy person would feel their feet were writing a manageable poem. He was respectful about windows. He never intruded on a closed shutter. But if a person stood at a casement in their nightshirt, wondering whether to send a message, he made the ink look especially cooperative, and if the message was not sent, he tucked the glow back into his lamp without comment. Suna, by day, pretended to know none of this. She liked a good forthright declaration. Still, on certain afternoons, she let a cloud soften the glare so that people could talk beneath it, without squinting. A small kindness from a very luminous friend. Even the runes themselves had opinions, which they expressed by appearing where no one remembered carving them. On a gatepost, a Fehu rune that looked suspiciously like a suggestion to share resources. On a driftwood plank, a Jabo rune that gift-shaped cross-polished as if by affectionate thumbs. Odin claimed jurisdiction over the runes and accepted credit for these appearances with his standard managerial nod. But privately he suspected the runes acted on their own when feelings were well behaved. Runes respect a plan. Unspoken desire is often a plan under a blanket. Valkyries, between errands, carried bits of this hush in their saddlebags alongside combs, spare ties, and a small scroll of names written in an elegant hand that made even a scribble look eligible for a poem. Sometimes, while their horses drank from a cold stream, a Valkyrie would take out the scroll and add not a name, but a thought. The baker with a good laugh. The woman who always steadies the ladder. The boy who whistles because he wants the birds to feel included. These were not candidates for Valhalla. They were candidates for being remembered the right way. You can only rule the end of battles if you also collect these tiny nations of tenderness dot in Midgard. Meanwhile, the echo of love traveled in sensible shoes. It stopped at bathhouses where steam gave people permission to sigh. It lingered over market stalls where someone picked the ripest apple and, thinking of someone else, traded it for the one with a funny shape that would make a better story. It leaned against door frames during storms and said, without words, that the roof would hold. In farms with one cow, it learned the rhythm of milk and the names of weather. In towns with one bridge, it knew whose feet found the middle and slowed. As if meeting fate, which is just a word for a person who answers you by using your name correctly. If you have ever made a second cup of tea because the kettle still felt friendly, you have practiced this echo's religion dot. All of these soft fidelities fed, in their pebble by pebble way, into the great river of consequence that the prophecies call Ragnarok. Not because desire is dangerous, but because desire is decisive, and the end of the world is a very large decision. When Freyr relinquished his sword to win Gur with patience and promise, an echo added itself to the ledger. One choice made for love that would later make a different afternoon interesting. When Frigg asked the world to be kind to Balder, her list of safe things became so long that it left only one small space for unkindness to fit. It eventually found it because unkindness has a good memory for leftover shapes. When Saijin chose a bowl and kept choosing it, the rhythm of drops became a metronome for certain future trembling. And when two people who will never be named leaned against a wall and admitted, in almost silence, that they were the reason the other had started smiling in the mornings, the wall kept that warmth and gave a little of it back to the next traveler. In need of courage. The end of the world is made of such things, in the same way snow is made of individual quiet agreements to land dot at this hour, with the torches reduced to polite arithmetic and the air sweet with yesterday's smoke. You can almost walk among these echoes without disturbing them. They are not ghosts. They are intentions that retired from service and took up needlework. They knit hats for cold hills. They darn the places on roads where feet drag. They whisper to the hinges of gates, asking them to mind their manners so goodbyes won't squeal. If you lean close to the world tree, you might hear the little thrum of their needles. Yggdrasil is old, but it enjoys cozy renovations. Somewhere in its bark, someone carved 2 letters that were never finished, and the tree has grown around them protectively, as if keeping a spare bookmark in case the carver returns. If you've stayed awake this far, you might wonder about your own unmailed letters and unannounced affections. The North would tell you to put them somewhere gentle. A pocket works, or the space between a pair of socks that understand each other. If you leave them beneath your pillow, Nott will inventory them while you sleep and assign them to the right departments. Will blossom with time. Already beautiful as is, no further action required, but please keep smiling. Bureaucracy, when managed by goddesses, is mercifully patient. And if you have nothing at all to file tonight, that is a kind of love too, the comfortable emptiness that makes a room generous for other people's stories near dawn. The hall takes a preparatory breath. The echoes draw their shawls around their shoulders and line up near the door, ready to go out into the day disguised as ordinary good manners. Heimdall clears his throat not to sound an alarm, but to say good morning to the dew. The benches stretch a negligible amount. Someone perhaps you turns on your side and the pillow understands. Desire, unrevealed, doesn't resent the sun. It travels well in daylight. It slides into the way a name is spoken, the way a hand pauses an extra heartbeat before letting go of a cup, the way a promise is phrased to be easier to keep. And when evening returns, it will come back here and hang itself on the appropriate peg beside the door like a well-behaved cloak. The prophecies will continue toward their distant meeting of fire and sea. The gods will keep their calendars and sharpen what needs sharpening. Yet all the while, the soft echo of wanting, never loud, never urgent, will keep teaching the world how to end politely. It leaves notes. Wipe your feet. Address each person by their preferred kenning. Water the pines. If the final trumpet must sound, let it be clean and in tune. If ships must sail, let them remember how to leave room for each other in the channel. If wolves must open their mouths, may they have first been used to carry sleeping pups. That is the tone desire asks of destiny. Tender, exact, unembarrassed. You can rest in that. In a few breaths, the sky will lighten like someone finding the right page. Until then, you are welcome to drift in the chair where Odin once forgot to. Be busy in the room where Frigg keeps the broom upright, among the letters Hell quietly stacked by size. The echoes are not in a rush, neither are we. They will keep on telling the tiniest truth that the heart, even when it says nothing, keeps. The world's manners intact long after you fall asleep,